If you paid attention to the 2024 election this past November, you'd know Donald Trump won and defeated Kamala Harris. But the final House race was just called on December 4th, a full month after Trump was declared winner. And in terms of total votes cast this election, that is yet to be finalized due to the slow vote counting in states like New York and California. Even though the last provisional ballots will be counted over the next few days, enough time has passed to see the patterns and themes from this past election. So in this video, I'll discuss how Donald Trump was the second president in U.S. history to win two non-consecutive presidential terms, and why. Politics is all about timing. You can be down one week and then back up the next. One mistake and it's over, or maybe multiple mistakes simply get baked in. But there's no surety, and that's what made Donald Trump such a thorn in the Democrat side for the past 8 years. In 2016, Trump went from an unserious flawed candidate to a serious flawed candidate to eventual presidential winner just in a span of a year and a half. A cult of personality that continued after he was elected until a once-in-a-generation virus took down a one-of-a-kind president that ended in admonishment from multiple lawmakers and voters of Trump's own party. It was over until it wasn't. As the saying goes, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And in 2020, the Democrats took their opportunity to stop Trump in what they believed was best for the country, only to forget why Trump was popular and still almost won in a year where unemployment hit double digits and hundreds of thousands of people had died from COVID-19 under Trump's watch. What happened after Trump, though, is where we can see how the comeback was possible. The first 2 years of the Biden presidency achieved relative success with the Democratic House and Senate majority, passing COVID relief and the American Rescue Plan, a major social initiative passed with the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act to boost semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S., and an actual infrastructure bill, all which were really great things that will help America keep separating itself from the rest of the world going forward. But while most of these initiatives were great, most folks really wouldn't see dividends pay out immediately, as a lot of these programs take months and even years to produce results. And while these victories mounted for Dems in Congress, Americans were noticing what was immediately affecting them at home on a day-to-day basis, which was mostly inflation, a lingering crime issue that emerged from COVID, and an emerging issue with immigration at the southern border. By 2022, Republicans had felt good about their midterm prospects until a huge wrench from the Supreme Court was thrown into the fold, when the court ruled that the Constitution did not confer a right to abortion. The midterm momentum was halted, and the red wave that was projected never came. While Republicans were projected to take the Senate and House back from the Democrats, they didn't take the Senate, and they barely won the House of Representatives back. A few weeks later, Donald Trump, still with a considerably high disapproval rating, would announce his candidacy for president again. With the repudiation of Republicans in Congress that Donald Trump felt only he could save, Democrats were feeling good and could look at the midterm results and say, see, we're doing fine, which would eventually be an enormous false flag that would hurt them in the future. As time went on and inflation remained an issue, the situation at the southern border started to become more of a front and center issue. As countries like Haiti and Venezuela continued to go through social unrest, the citizens of those countries, along with other Latin American countries, saw their chance as the Biden administration ended the Remain in Mexico policy in the middle of 2022, a policy which forced migrants seeking asylum to remain in Mexico while they awaited their court order date in the U.S. And they had also ended Title 42 in 2023, which the Trump administration had put in place during COVID to allow Customs and Border Patrol to deny immigrants entry into the U.S. altogether. With both of these policies rescinded, the Biden administration was looking to come up with ways to reduce the influx of immigrants in more practical and humane ways by changing the asylum process. But even as they did, the statistics had still not abated, and Biden figured the only way to do something to enact real long-lasting change to the border crisis was through Congress, which eventually came to fruition when Republican James Lankford helped write an immigration bill to address illegal immigration and asylum seekers at the border. However, after months of negotiations went by, Donald Trump told Republican lawmakers that passing an immigration bill would hurt his campaign efforts, and in turn, the potential border solution was dropped early in 2024. While all this was going on, Biden's approval rating continued to go lower and lower, and Trump slowly saw his approval ratings climb as inflation and immigration headlines remained in focus, and Biden's own physical health became a concern to voters as well. When running in 2020, one of Biden's weaknesses was the fact that he would be one of the oldest candidates to run, but he got through that criticism as his elderly statesman persona shone through, and voters' remembrance of him as Obama's VP was a check of confidence by voters. But after the 2022 midterms, going into 2023, Biden had visibly lost a step or two. He was noticeably making more verbal errors or pauses when talking to the press, walking slowly or physically tripping up in public, and it was getting harder not to notice. Regardless, at this point, Trump was gaining momentum in public opinion. Folks were struggling to pay for groceries and gas prices were high. So, January 6th and the threats of democracy were not at the forefront of folks' most pressing concerns, no matter how many times Democrats would explain how bad Trump was for democracy. Each day that went through 2023, from the beginning of the Republican and Democratic primaries, Donald Trump's message grew stronger, even while fending off opponents in his own party, and Biden's message grew weaker, even though he also easily won his own primary as well. But it was clear Americans were frustrated, and Biden couldn't market himself and his accomplishments well enough to quell folks' concerns, while the issues themselves weren't letting up either. Inflation, the border, and a conflict in the Middle East continue to rattle Democrats and lead to unrest in the country. As both candidates prepared for a general election, the polling was already looking grim for Biden compared to where he was in 2020, as he was either losing to Trump nationally or only up a point or two in most polls. Then came the debate, the infamous debate, one that will go down in history as one of the worst debates because of how bad both candidates performed, but especially due to Biden's forgetfulness and malaise that was the beginning of the end for his campaign. The fallout was immediate, as voters, fellow Democrats, and politicians saw a candidate that did not have the political chops and instincts it takes to rally a country together and campaign effectively. No matter how much he loved the country, or how many follow-up sit-down interviews he gave to ensure he was up for the job, Democrats knew a change had to be made. Not long after the debate, on July 13th at a rally in Pennsylvania, there was an attempted assassination of the former President Donald Trump, and the images thereafter would go on to be a rallying cry for the candidate and his movement, only furthering folks away from Biden and towards Trump. Shortly after this, Biden would pass the torch to Kamala Harris, his VP, stepping down as the Democratic candidate for president. The Harris campaign started off strong, a younger candidate, a woman of color, and someone who could campaign with vigor every day to push back against Trump more effectively. While the energy was palpable and changed the trajectory of Democrats' chances of winning in November, it didn't hinder Trump's chances. While the Trump campaign struggled to characterize Harris, she had the opportunity to set herself apart from Biden and make her case to the American people of why she deserved a chance at the presidency, and the following weeks and months became a persuasion of whether Harris's vision of the future was different enough from Biden's to make a difference, and if people were tired of Trump's brash nature and conservative policies. We saw what happened at the end of a long election night on November 4th. Between a debate win against Trump, a Taylor Swift endorsement, a treasure trove of campaign cash, and a ground game that knocked on hundreds of thousands of doors, she lost to Donald Trump. But it wasn't due to her lack of trying, and quite frankly, all of these things added up in spite of an environment we now know is a lot tougher for Harris than folks on the left initially thought. While Harris's numbers improved and her polling looked miles better than Joe Biden's, the signs were always there, and the uphill battle was a race against the clock. Border crossings were approaching the lows seen during Trump's presidency back in 2019, the stock market was at all-time highs, unemployment at relative lows, GDP revisions to the upside, interest rates being lowered, crime rates down, lower gas prices. So what didn't click for voters? Here's the breakdown. Point 1. Biden and his team were living in an alternate reality. Internal polls after the debate showed him possibly losing the Electoral College 408 to 130, the biggest blowout since Reagan. When asked about the economy, Biden would say it was the best economy ever, even when polling showed folks were still upset. When asked about his age, Biden said he wasn't too old, even though polls showed that was a major concern for voters. His campaign told reporters the polls were wrong every step of the way, and he was the strongest candidate in the race until the 11th hour when he finally stepped aside, giving his VP a short turnaround time to run a presidential campaign with her own resources. Biden was able to get big things done, but never took the time to explain the how and the why to people. Biden did a horrible job messaging his wins. Passing good legislation means nothing if half the country doesn't even know what you've done. Throughout his presidency, Biden was too focused on Congress and not focused enough on what the American people needed to hear. Point number 2. Harris couldn't do enough to separate herself from Biden. When co-host Sunny Hostin on The View asked Harris whether she would have done anything differently from President Joe Biden over the past 4 years, Harris responded, quote, "There's not a thing that comes to mind," end quote. An error that her campaign knew had to be addressed, but the damage was done and the effort in fixing it wouldn't be enough. Point number 3. The domestic trends came in too late for Harris and Democrats. Interest rates and immigration crossings started to go down later in 2024, and during the hectic campaign season was too much to get through as a new normal, and not just as a data point. For however much folks think the left controls mainstream media, Republicans have a well-oiled media machine on their side that was able to get ahead of this and drive narratives that things were still bad regardless of whether they've improved. Point 4. Global trends had shown that incumbents were losing everywhere. Japan, UK, Spain, Argentina, Germany. Anywhere where COVID and inflation hit hard, the folks who were in charge during that time were all on the chopping block and lost. A repudiation of COVID leadership was almost impossible to salvage. Point 5. Folks remember the economy under Trump and didn't attribute COVID to his presidency. Cheap groceries and lower gas prices were because of Trump, but the death toll wasn't. No matter how ahistorical it sounds, through all the death and destruction, people remembered one thing under Trump: affordability. Point 6. The abortion issue just died. After 2 years of inflation and immigration, abortion remained important, but not nearly as an everyday issue on people's minds. Trump tried to abate this by saying he wouldn't sign a national abortion ban, and voters believed it was enough. Point 7. Democracy under threat was a big issue. For Republicans, a lot of folks, including myself, figured that democracy being a top issue was a boon for Democrats going into election night, but exit polls showed Trump voters also worried about this, but for very different reasons. Lawfare and the perceived persecution of Trump was actually where concern stemmed from, less so about the worry about him being some type of dictator or authoritarian, which voters polled said they never even understood. A huge pie in the face moment for Democrats. Point 8. Consumer sentiment. Inflation and affordability were obvious issues, but the data should have been more obvious as consumer sentiment surveys never recovered after rebounding in 2021 and then decreasing thereafter. Under Trump, consumer sentiment hit 101 right before COVID hit, before slowly decreasing to around 77 before the 2020 election. Hope under a Biden regime revived the number to 88 in April 2021, but that would be the highest it ever got, sinking to a severe low of 50 in June of 2022, and ending up at a measly 70 in October 2024 before the election. Point number 9. Surveys showing the country was on the wrong track were historically high at the end of Biden's presidency, and the numbers never improved enough over Harris's campaign to make a difference. Point 10. Democrats completely bungled the immigration issue, plain and simple. Biden knew it and did what he could to improve the border in the past year, but voters knew it was something that should have been addressed much earlier. Point 11. Voters thought Kamala was still too liberal, while Trump was still considered a more moderate candidate. Joe Manchin afterwards said Trump didn't just win MAGA, he won the middle. And he was right. Point 12. Being a woman candidate is hard. A decent portion of the population just doesn't feel like women can exude tough leadership and stand up to world leaders. It's a harsh reality, but one that Kamala couldn't overcome. Point 13. Both Harris and Biden have lost touch with the younger male demographic. Not just white males, but Black and Latino males as well. Voters like authenticity, which for however many faults Trump has, he doesn't lack in. Going on Rogan or having a conversation outside of traditional media is now the new normal, and the Harris camp was too cautious not to make a mistake that they couldn't reach this segment as effectively. The 14th and final point, Democrats have forgotten about their base. Losing the popular vote for the first time since 2004 is a big warning sign for Dems going forward that while you work on passing an agenda you ran on, you still can't forget about the issues going on in the present moment. Looking towards the future is important, but there is no future for Democrats if they can't win in the moment. Overall, Democrats should still be impressed with how Harris performed. For someone with months to campaign and win an election, the results may seem tough, but they could have been much worse based on how Biden's own internal polls were looking. As of today, Kamala Harris did lose the popular vote, but only by around 1.5%. And lost the determining swing states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan by just 230,000 votes. Democrats are facing a tough 2 years as both chambers will be in Republican control, but Harris's ground game efforts may have staved off an even bigger bloodbath, and the House of Representatives is close enough to make Trump's life a little harder. But most of the blame here is on Biden, a candidate and president who, for as much good as he intended, could not get out of his own way. If Biden had promised one term and laid the groundwork for an actual primary, we may have seen Democrats retain the presidency. but we'll never know. Instead, Donald Trump completed the comeback and won. Through the literal trials and tribulations at the end of his first term, the court cases, litigation of election tampering, civil trial for rape, fraudulent business dealings, assassination attempts, debate performances, campaign bumbles and stumbles, he still won because, after all,
It's the economy, stupid. Okay?